Number 10. The cattle of Nabta Playa. She was a young adult female, healthy, in the prime of her breeding life, which made her the single most valuable thing her owners possessed. Not meat. Milk and calves and every calf those calves would ever have. They killed her anyway, laid her on her left side in a clay-lined pit, roofed it, and piled sandstone over the top. Fred Wendorf and Romuald Schild spent close to 30 years excavating the basin she was found in a dry, kidney-shaped depression in the Egyptian Sahara, 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel, where nothing now grows and nothing now lives. Along the bank of an old wadi they found 15 low stone mounds. 9 have been opened. Under one was the cow. The other 8 held cattle bone, broken and scattered. None of this happened in a desert. Around 11,000 years ago, the summer monsoon pushed north and the Sahara filled with lakes, grass, and herding families. Nabta Playa, among the wettest spots on the map, its floor dotted with huts, hearths, and a well sunk 2.5 meters into the sediment. Then the rain retreated. Exactly how fast is one of the longest-running arguments in African paleoclimate. A marine core off Mauritania points to an abrupt collapse around 5,000 years ago. Sediment from Lake Yoa in Chad shows a slow decline stretched from 6,000 years ago to 4,300. The likely truth is a compromise, fast where you happen to be standing, staggered across the region as a whole. That is the world that produced a buried cow, burying the future of the herd, deliberately, because the alternative was worse. The site is more than mounds. Roughly 30 megalithic structures cluster nearby, and in 1998, the astronomer J. McKim Malville, working with Wendorf and Schild, published a case in Nature for cardinal and solstice alignments among them. The limits here are real. No stone at Nabta Playa has ever been directly dated, and no published analysis runs a statistical test on the alignments. The cow herself has exactly one radiocarbon date, taken from tamarisk wood in the chamber roof, 6,480 years before present, give or take 270. That margin alone spans more than 1,000 years, which means the tidy version of this story, that she died as the rain began to fail, cannot actually be tested against the climate record. It can only be reasoned toward. Savino di Lernia made that case in 2006, reading the burials as a response to abrupt environmental change. Augustin Hall argued in 2020 that disease in the herds fits the evidence just as well, and the more skeptical view points out that these pits also hold sheep and goat, deposited one animal at a time, thin ground for declaring a cult of anything. Nobody was sacrificed at Nabta Playa. The human graves there are ordinary. What was surrendered was livestock, by people who were running out of water and would soon walk away from the basin entirely. The mounds are still there, on the bank of a wadi that hasn't carried water in 5,000 years. The oldest entry on this list, and the one we can prove the least about. Number 9. The pits at Sanxingdui. In 1986, brickyard workers digging clay outside Guanghan, in China's Sichuan province, cut into a pit packed with bronze. A second pit turned up 20 meters away that August. Together, they held close to 1,400 objects, 80 elephant tusks between them, 4,000 cowrie shells, more than 100 near-life-size bronze heads, 6 still wearing masks of hammered gold, a standing bronze figure 2.5 meters tall, and a bronze tree, restored to nearly 4 meters, that once stood close to 5. At least 8 such trees are now known. Nobody can say what they represented, because nobody at Sanxingdui left behind any writing at all. Every object in those pits had been destroyed before it went in. Bronzes broken, jades broken and scattered through the fill, tusks burnt, and, in Pit 1, more than 3 cubic meters of burnt, broken animal bone, an enormous quantity of slaughtered livestock reduced to charcoal in a single operation. That single fact turns 2 rich hordes into a ritual. 6 more pits, found in 2019, were excavated through 2022 by teams from the Sichuan Provincial Institute of Cultural Relics and Archaeology, Peking University, and Sichuan University, adding roughly 13,000 objects and more than 700 burnt tusks to the count. Bamboo charcoal from one pit's ash layer dated at Peking University and modeled in 2021, puts the deposit at 1199 to 1017 BC, the late Shang period, contemporary with the Oracle Bone Kings 1100 kilometers to the northeast, whose art looks nothing like this. Two later studies changed what kind of ceremony this actually was. In 2023, researchers from Chengdu University of Technology measured the color and magnetism of the pit sediments and objects and put the burning temperature at 600 to 800 degrees Celsius, hot enough to bleach jade and carbonize ivory. More importantly, they found the burning hadn't happened in the pits at all. It happened somewhere else, and the ash was carried in afterward. A 2025 soil study confirmed it. So the sequence runs in two acts: a fire off-site, into which went the images, the trees, the masks, the tusks, and the herds. Then a set of pits, dug and filled deliberately, large bronzes placed above the smaller fragments. Not looting, not panic. Somebody was tidy about it. No human remains have ever turned up in any of these pits. What was destroyed was the visible apparatus of an entire religion, its gods, faces, the trees, that held its cosmos together. And in 2025, the excavation team announced that fragments of single broken objects had been matched across 6 different pits, meaning all of it may have gone into the ground in one event. The popular story has this city drowned by a flood. The geology doesn't support it. The flood deposits nearby are centuries too early. An earthquake diverting the river is plausible and would explain an abandonment. It doesn't explain a bonfire. 40 kilometers away, at Jinsha, the same style of gold and jade reappears just as Sanxingdui fades. We have the gods. We don't have a single name for them. Number 8. The Tophet at Carthage. In 1921, 2 collectors bought a carved limestone slab from illegal diggers outside Tunis. A Punic priest, carrying a child. They bought the land it came from and started digging. What came out of the ground was a walled precinct in continuous use for 6 centuries, packed with buried urns of ash and burnt bone, topped by more than 6,000 inscribed stones addressed to the god Baal-Hamon and the goddess Tanit. Popular counts put the total near 20,000 urns, the only sealed, published sample, 445 urns, lifted by an American team between 1976 and 1979, is the actual evidence. Of those, 323 held human remains, nearly all newborns or infants. 59 held animals only, about a quarter held both, an infant and a lamb burnt together on the same fire. The lambs were 1 to 3 months old, which puts the burning at lambing season late winter or spring. Here is where the entry stops being straightforward, because specialists disagree about whether anyone was killed here at all. In 2010, Jeffrey Schwartz used tooth formation stages to age 348 urns and 540 individuals, and concluded this was a cemetery for infants who had died naturally. A fifth of his samples scored as prenatal. 26 showed no neonatal line at all. Patricia Smith, working with Joseph Green and Lawrence Steger, found the flaw. Cremation shrinks a tooth, and it shrinks unevenly, costing a developing crown roughly 6 weeks of apparent age. Correct for that, and Schwartz's distribution shifts, peaking at 1 to 1.5 months old. Not an ordinary infant cemetery after all. A third line of evidence has no bones in it at all. The inscriptions above these urns are votive, written in the language of a vow. One recurring phrase, offering of a lamb, appears in an identical grammatical construction with the word for a human being. One of those two things can only mean a sheep. The literary record is hostile and mostly late. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC about a siege in 310 BC, describes 200 children of noble families sacrificed publicly, plus 300 more from families accused of dodging the levy, rolled from a bronze idol's sloping hands into a pit of fire, a detail that recurs almost verbatim in other authors, which usually signals one shared story rather than several independent witnesses. And yet the deposition rate at a related site in Sicily works out to 1 or 2 urns a year across 4 centuries, with no published spike during any known war or siege. The trend tracks the ordinary growth of the city, which leaves an uncomfortable middle: dead infants and young lambs, burnt and dedicated to two gods for 600 years, most of whom appear to have died on their own, and some of whom, the inscriptions insist, did not. 3 centuries after Carthage was destroyed, 5 Roman-era stelae in Algeria, dedicated to Saturn, still carried the formula: soul for soul, blood for blood, life for life, sometimes with a lamb offered as substitute. Whatever was paid at that site outlived the city that paid it. Number 7. The bones that asked for rain: an ox shoulder blade, scraped flat, with rows of shallow hollows chiseled into the back. A heated rod goes into a hollow. The bone splits along an uncontrollable hairline crack on the front. A diviner reads it. A scribe carves the question beside the crack, and sometimes the outcome. They were being sold in Chinese pharmacies as dragon bones until the scholar Wang Yirong recognized the marks as writing in 1899. The source was Anyang, last capital of the Shang dynasty, occupied roughly 1250 to 1046 BC. Between 150,000 and 200,000 inscribed pieces are known today, carrying around 1,200 distinct characters, the oldest body of writing in East Asia, and a striking amount of it about weather. Will Dai order rain sufficient for the harvest? Will Dai bring drought upon us? Will Dai end this city? Dai, the high power, received no offerings, too remote to bargain with. What could be reached were the royal ancestors and river spirits. And the same archive that asks whether rain is coming also records exactly what was paid to move it. Shall we sacrifice 100 Chang people to the great ancestors? Shall we sacrifice 2 elders of the Chang tribe to Grandfather Ding? The Chang were pastoralists west of Shang territory, and they were the primary supply. Counting every sacrificial inscription, the historian Huang Jianyue arrived at 13,052 recorded human victims, at least 7,000 of them Qiang. Under one king, Wu Ding, the recorded total alone passes 9,000. The ground matches the archive. The royal cemetery at Jibaigang holds more than 2,500 sacrificial pits of humans, animals, and chariots. Over 1,300 excavated, some 900 holding people only. At least 3,460 individuals among them, often 10 to a pit, some headless, some with heads and no bodies, buried in the same fill and by the same procedure as the cattle, sheep, and pigs beside them. Then, in 2017, isotope work changed the timeline entirely. Christina Chung, working with Jigen Tang, Jing Zichen, Darlene Weston, and Michael Richards, measured carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur in 68 sacrificial victims against 39 ordinary residents of the same city. Every individual who could be sexed was male, most dead between 15 and 50. Sulfur showed they hadn't grown up at Anyang. Carbon and nitrogen showed that by the time they died, they were eating exactly what everyone else in the city ate, mostly millet, with little animal protein. Scholars reading the inscriptions alone had assumed captives were killed within about 8 days of capture. The chemistry says something else. They were held for years, long enough for their bodies to rebuild themselves around the diet of the place that was going to kill them. So the machinery runs like this. A king asks whether the high god intends drought. The cracks are red. An offering is specified. Men captured on a Western campaign, who have lived in the city on millet for years, are brought out and killed in groups of 10, their heads buried apart from their bodies, near the tombs of the ancestors being asked to intervene. We have the names of the kings who asked, the ancestors they addressed, the diviners who read the cracks, and the precise count of people handed over. The one name the archive never wrote down belongs to any of the 13,000. Number 6. The beaded burial at Cahokia. Melvin Fowler began cutting into Mound 72 in 1967 on the floodplain east of what is now St. Louis, and by 1971 had taken apart a low ridge-top mound some 43 meters long, holding more than 250 people buried across at least 6 separate episodes. Cahokia arrived fast. A village of perhaps 1,500 to under 3,000 people grew, within 50 years of AD 1050, into a city of 10,000 to 15,000, with plazas, a grid, and an earthen pyramid 30 meters high, a scale with no precedent anywhere nearby. At the center of Mound 72 lay two bodies, stacked, surrounded by more than 20,000 shell beads, hauled up from the Gulf of Mexico and counted out deliberately. Around them, a pit of 53 young women laid in 2 layers, another with 19 women and 35,000 more beads, a group of 4 men, elbows linked, heads and hands removed. For 40 years, this was read one way: a dead king, a warrior elite, retainers and captives killed to accompany a great man into the ground, a cape of beads shaped like a falcon laid across his body. It was a good story, and it was wrong. In 2016, Thomas Emerson, Kristen Hedman, Eve Hargrave, Don Cobb, and Andrew Thompson reanalyzed the deposit for American antiquity. The 2 central bodies weren't 2 men, one was a woman. The central feature held not 6 people but at least 12, including further male-female pairs and a child of about 5. Of 23 individuals in that section, roughly 10 were women, and the beads were never arranged as a falcon at all. The shape is irregular across multiple deposits, and the cape everyone had pictured simply isn't there. They're reading, not a chief's funeral, but a rite of creation and renewal, centered on a paired man and woman, performed at the moment a city was being invented. Strontium isotopes had already dismantled the other half of the story. A 2015 study by Andrew Thompson, Kristen Hedman, and Philip Slater found about 91% of sampled individuals fell within the local range. The young women in the mass graves weren't foreign tribute or captured brides. They were the floodplain's own daughters. Only one small group carried a distinct outside signature, and that group shows the clear evidence of violent death, possibly the actual war captives everyone had assumed the rest were. A radiocarbon range for the central feature, roughly AD 9911023, may place this rite slightly before the city's explosive growth rather than after it. If that holds, the ceremony came first, and the city followed. Cahokia was largely empty by AD 1350, for reasons still argued over: flooding, drought, deforestation, political failure, each with a published rebuttal. What didn't happen is what the word collapse implies. The region was reoccupied within a century and a half, and the descendants of the people who built that mound are still here. The most confident story told about this site for 2 generations turned out, on a second look, to be almost entirely wrong. Number 5. The children carried up the volcanoes. In February 1999, Johann Reinhard and Constanza Cerruti reached a stone platform on the summit ridge of Lulayaco, a volcano on the Argentina-Chile border, above 6,700 meters, the highest archaeological site on Earth. Beneath it lay 3 children, a girl of about 13, and a boy and girl around 4 or 5. Frozen for 5 centuries at an altitude where nothing decays, they remain among the best-preserved human bodies ever found. Skin, hair, eyelashes, internal organs, even stomach contents intact. More than 100 such sites are now known above 5,200 meters across Peru, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, nearly all built within a single 60-year window, 1470 to 1532, a state program called capacocha. Spanish chroniclers recorded exactly why it was performed: a new emperor's accession, his illness or death, the birth of a son, a victory in war, the dedication of a temple, or a natural disaster, drought, epidemic, earthquake, eruption. Molina wrote that towns across the empire sent children of about 10 to the capital, along with fine cloth and figurines. Hernandez Principe recorded one case by name, a girl called Tanta Carhua, 10 years old, taken up a mountain, her selection raising her father to local office. The disturbing part is what happened in the year before. In 2013, Andrew Wilson's team read the older Lulayaco girl's 28-centimeter hair, more than 2 years of growth, as a chemical diary, segment by segment tracking coca metabolites and alcohol markers. About 12 months before she died, everything changes at once. Her diet shifts from the food of a highland peasant to elite fare, rich in protein and maize, and sustained coca chewing begins in the same window, almost certainly the moment she was chosen. 6 months before the end, her hair was cut and the cutting placed in a pouch that traveled with her to the summit. Ancient DNA confirmed it was hers. In her final 3 months, the isotopes shift again, tracking meltwater and stored maize from higher ground, the pilgrimage itself. In her last 6 to 8 weeks, both coca and alcohol markers peak, and the braiding in her hair was done in her final days. The two younger children show far lower levels of both. They were not treated the same way. She was also gravely ill. Protein analysis of swabs from her lips in 2012 found immune markers of an active bacterial lung infection alongside DNA from the tuberculosis group, matched by a shadow on a lung scan. The boy, buried a few meters away, had none of it. How the three of them actually died isn't established. None of the Yulayako children shows injury, and this needs to be said plainly, because elsewhere the trauma is unmistakable. A girl found at Cerro Aconcagua in 1985 died from a blow that fractured her skull over 5 centimeters. The mountain that preserved the Yulayako children is also the reason they were found at all. A nearby volcano's 1990s reawakening dropped dark ash onto the ice, which absorbed sunlight, melted, and released a bundle that had been sealed for 550 years. Number 4. Huanchaquito-Las Llamas. Gabriel Prieto went to a stretch of sand behind the beach at Huanchaco, north of Trujillo, Peru, expecting an ordinary Chimu fishing settlement. Working with osteologist John Verano from 2011 to 2016, he instead uncovered 140 people, 137 of them children, and more than 200 llamas, all from a single 700-square-meter patch of sand. The children were 5 to 14, mostly 8 to 12, both sexes, wrapped in plain cotton shrouds, some with faces painted in red cinnabar, some in distinctive cotton headdresses. The llamas were young, 3/4 of them under 9 months. Nearly every child whose chest survived intact carries a single clean cut straight across the breastbone. The llamas carry the identical cut in the identical place. The chest was opened in one stroke in an animal, and in a child, by someone who had done it before. The excavators are careful in print, noting only that removal of the heart is a likely motivation. The children face west, toward the sea. The llamas face east, toward the mountains. 20 radiocarbon dates from 2 independent labs place the whole deposit in a single layer, a single event, sometime between AD 1400 and 1450. What makes this site different is what the ground itself recorded. Above the burial layer is a surface of dried mud that had been walked on while still wet. Sandal prints, small bare child footprints, the 2-toed prints of llamas, dog prints, and at least 2 erosion channels cut by water on a coast where it essentially never rains. The Chimu state that ruled this coast for 5 centuries from the city of Chanchan ran on irrigation across a desert. Its one unanswerable enemy was the periodic warming of the eastern Pacific that drowns fields built for none of it. The correlation writes itself, and this is exactly where the excavators refuse to run with it. No independent climate record dates a specific flood event to this exact year. The mud proves only that hard rain had recently fallen on a coast where hard rain is a catastrophe. It also wasn't unique. At Pampa La Cruz, a couple of kilometers away, the same team has documented 6 separate sacrificial events across roughly 4 centuries, dated by 80 radiocarbon measurements, running from Chimu into Inca rule. Several hundred more children across the 2 sites, including one group laid on an artificial mound beside irrigation works, feet pointing east, which Prieto reads as an offering meant to energize the fields rather than to stop a flood. Huanchaquito is the largest single child sacrifice known anywhere in the archaeological record, and the evidence says it wasn't a single spasm of panic. It was the largest known instance of something this state appears to have done, in an orderly fashion, with specialists, again and again. Number 3. The boys beneath Chichén Itzá. In 1967, a construction crew cutting an airstrip near the Great Pyramid at Chichén Itzá broke into a choltun, a bell-shaped cistern hollowed from limestone, 300 meters northeast of the sacred cenote, no longer used for water. A small natural cave was attached to it, and inside were the bones of at least 106 infants and children. They sat in storage for more than 50 years. In June 2024, a team led by Rodrigo Barquera at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published 64 whole genomes recovered from that chamber. 26 radiocarbon dates spread the deposit across 5 centuries, heaviest around AD 800-1000. Half the children were 3 to 6 years old, none had reached adulthood, and all 64 were boys, a result that alone overturns a story that had survived a century, built on Spanish chronicles that described girls being thrown into the cenote itself. That story was already shaky. Edward Thompson's dredging of the cenote between 1904 and 1910 turned up roughly twice as many children as adults, and more males than females among those whose sex could be determined. Then the genomes found something nobody had predicted. 16 of the 64 boys, a quarter of the sample, were close relatives of another child in the same chamber. 9 pairs, mostly brothers, 2 of them identical twins. Their diets clustered too, suggesting they'd been raised in the same households. Someone was choosing brothers, deliberately, across centuries, and twice in a sample of 64, they chose twins. Twins are not incidental in Maya religion. In the Popol Vuh, a pair of brothers is defeated in the underworld ball court and sacrificed, and one severed head fathers the hero twins who avenge them. The paper's authors draw that line explicitly. It remains an interpretation, but the pattern itself, targeting the relationship, not just the child, is not. There are no cut marks on any of these boys, and that limit has to be stated plainly. It separates this chamber from the cenote 300 meters away, where the bones do carry cuts, dismemberment, and burning, and where isotopes show victims arriving from across Mesoamerica. The boys in the Chultun were local. The rain god Chak is the obvious context, and the drought record is genuine. Lake sediment nearby shows the interval around AD 800-1000 as the driest stretch of the mid to late Holocene, and a 2018 reconstruction from gypsum-trapped water put the rainfall shortfall at 41 to 54%, with spikes to 70%. The 2024 paper doesn't test that connection directly. It mentions Chak once and runs no formal comparison against the climate record. The paper's final finding reaches forward instead of back. Genomes from 68 people living today in Tixcacaltuyub, a nearby Maya town, show direct continuity with the children in the chamber, and across the 11 centuries between them, 8 immune-related genes have shifted significantly, one toward resistance to enteric fever, the same disease identified in a 1545 epidemic mass grave. It isn't proof that colonial epidemics reshaped this lineage's immune system, but the shape of it is hard to miss. For 5 centuries, boys were taken from local families and placed in a cistern beside a sacred well, in pairs where possible, in a landscape where the rain kept failing. Their descendants outlived them by 8 centuries, then survived something else entirely. And that survival is written into people alive right now, who can tell you the name of their town. Number 2. The sacrifice the earthquake interrupted, Yanis Saklarakis and Ifi Sapuna Saklaraki, began digging at Anemospilia in 1979, on the north slope of Mount Juktas, a few kilometers south of Knossos. What came out of the ground was a building unlike anything else on the island. 3 rooms in a row, fronted by a corridor, brought down in a single collapse around 1700 BC, the same horizon that ended the first palaces at Knossos and Phaistos. Under the fallen masonry were 4 people. One lay on a low platform in the west room, male, about 18, curled on his right side, one leg bent back so sharply the heel nearly touched the thigh. Beside him, a bronze blade 40 centimeters long, engraved on both faces with a boar's snout and tusks. The excavators reported one further detail. The bones on his upper left side were white, on his lower right side black, which they read as fire acting on a body already drained of blood. The other 3 had been caught standing. A heavily built man in his late 30s, on his back, hands raised toward his face, both legs broken by falling stone, wearing a silver and iron ring. A woman face down in the corner, and a 4th person, crushed beyond recognition, beside a shattered bowl-shaped libation vessel. The reading that made this site famous is a ritual killing, interrupted mid-act by the very disaster it was meant to stop. The case against it is just as strong. Dennis Hughes argued in 1991 that the altar is a loose stone platform with nothing marking it as ceremonial, that the blade is a spearhead which may simply have fallen onto the body as the roof came down, that only one leg was flexed and the hands weren't bound, and that the 2-color bone is exactly what uneven burning produces, when part of a body lies against the ground, and part lies next to something flammable. In 2016, Sylvie Muller-Chelka went further. The West Room was a place where the dead were prepared. The young man was already dead when laid out. The crouch position is standard for contemporary burial, and the blade, ring, and seal are grave goods, not ritual tools. Even the earthquake is an inference. There's no fault trace and no geological study tying this specific building to a specific tremor. Only collapsed masonry, broken legs, ash, and the fact that other buildings nearby fell at roughly the same time. A 2017 volume of geologists and archaeologists explicitly warns the field against reaching for earthquakes as a default explanation, and rates this destruction as probable, not proven. One clean fact sits underneath the whole debate. Higher up the same mountain is the peak sanctuary of Juctus, its altar cut into a chasm more than 10 meters deep that nobody has ever fully excavated, packed with ash, burnt offerings, figurines, and bronze double axes. And in more than a century of work there, not one human bone has ever come out of it. So the most famous human sacrifice in the Aegean rests on a single building, a single floor, and a single afternoon, roughly 3,700 years ago. 3 of the 4 people who died there are simply dead. The 4th has been argued over for 45 years, and the argument is still open. Number 1. The New Fire. There is a hill in the southeast of Mexico City, 225 meters high, with a road to the top and a view across one of the largest cities on Earth. The Mexica called it Huanchaquito-Las. Once every 52 years, the world was scheduled to end there. The arithmetic behind that isn't mystical. It's exact. The Mexica ran 2 calendars simultaneously, a 365-day solar year and a 260-day ritual count. Any specific pairing between the two returns only once every 18,980 days, 52 solar years. Sahagun's informants told him plainly that the world was expected to end at the close of one of these cycles. Not might end. Scheduled to. Every other entry on this list answers something that had already gone wrong. A drought, a plague, an eruption. This one had a date on it, known decades ahead, arriving on time whether anything was wrong or not. The procedure, as recorded in 16th century sources, was total. Every fire in the empire extinguished. Hearthstones thrown out, cooking pots broken, houses swept clean. Priests walked out of Tenochtitlan to the hilltop and waited for midnight, for a marker star cluster to reach its high point. A captive was stretched out, his chest opened with a flint knife, and a fire drill worked in the wound until it caught. In his breast the new fire was drawn, in the words of the Florentine Codex. Runners carried the flame down the hill on pine torches, first to the Templo Mayor, then out across the lake, house by house, hearth by hearth. This is not only a text. Michael and Christina Smith published archaeological deposits from new fire ceremonies at 3 central Mexican sites in 2001, and the pattern they found matters. The rite predates the Aztec Empire, and was widespread before Tenochtitlan ever took it over. At least 8 surviving stone sculptures depict bound year bundles, and one, older than the Aztec state, is dated to a different year than the imperial version insisted on, meaning the schedule itself used to be local. The final ceremony was held in Reed 1507 under Moctezuma II, recorded 4 separate times, in a pictorial manuscript, on a greenstone fire serpent bearing his name glyph and the date, on a cliff relief at Chapultepec, and on a temple sculpture. The written sources are colonial, and everyone carries an agenda, so tie the fire and the knife to something that can be measured. Ximena Chavez Balderas examined human remains recovered from the Templo Mayor itself, over 1,000 individuals in the collection, 74 studied in detail, decapitation performed precisely between the 5th and 6th vertebrae, and, critically, not the cause of death. In one offering containing an infant, cuts on the inner surface of the ribs show the chest was opened from below the diaphragm, arteries severed with anatomical precision. In 2015, a few meters from the Templo Mayor, Raul Barrera Rodriguez's team found a tower built from human skulls, mortared into a cylinder. 63 registered by 2020, men, women, and children alike, which overturns a century-old assumption that a skull rack meant a rack of warriors. The scale has been fought over for 500 years. 2 16th-century sources claim 80,400 victims at the Great Temple's 1487 dedication. A demographer calculating the physical time it takes to kill a person put the ceiling nearer 14,000. Cortez, who had every reason to inflate the number, wrote only that 3,000 or 4,000 souls were sacrificed in a year. Both sides had reasons to lie, and one side lost the war that would have let them argue back. What the Mexica believed they were doing is better documented than what they actually did. In their account of the present age's beginning, the gods gathered in darkness at Teotihuacan, and the poorest, most disfigured among them threw himself into a fire so the sun would move. The rest followed. Everything alive afterward existed in debt for it. The offering that discharged that debt wasn't only hearts. It was paper, incense, rubber, quail, blood, drawn from one's own ears and tongue. It didn't mean a knife made the sun rise. It meant existence had already been paid for once, and had to be kept up. 14 years after the last new fire was lit on that hill, Tenochtitlan fell on August 13, 1521, 7 years before the 52-year cycle it belonged to was due to close. It's tempting to set those two dates side by side and hand the Mexica a prophecy. No Nahua source does that arithmetic. The famous omens said to have preceded the Spanish. The comet, the burning temple, the weeping woman, appear in a single text compiled half a century later by men trained in a Franciscan library, and historians read them as an explanation written after the fact by the defeated. What's actually there is the machinery, a calendar that couldn't be argued with, a hill outside the city, a captive chosen in advance, and the valley visible from its summit, holding more than 20 million people now, a valley where, once, every household fire was extinguished on the same night and relit from a single flame drawn out of a dying man's chest. That fire was never lit again. The sun came up anyway,